He only wanted to buy his first suit. At 17, Eli Parker had saved for months, picturing the moment he'd walk into the upscale store and leave with something that made him feel like he belonged. But the store manager saw him and decided, otherwise blocking his path, questioning his worth, and making sure everyone heard. What happened next would not only silence the room, but follow Eli far beyond the store's glass doors. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. It's the glass. Doors swung open with a faint chime that sounded far too delicate for Eli Parker's pounding heart. He stepped inside, careful not to let his scuffed sneakers squeak against the polished marble floor. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something sharper, like cologne meant to announce the wearer before they even spoke. It was the kind of place Eli had passed by a dozen times on his way home from school, never daring to go in until now. Today was different. Today, he had a folded envelope of cash in his back pocket. Months of mowing lawns, hauling groceries, and saving every spare dollar. He had come to buy his first suit. His backpack hung from one shoulder, the zipper frayed from years of use. The sleeves of his hoodie were pushed up, revealing arms still lean from teenage awkwardness. His jeans were faded but clean, the knees soft from wear. He had done his best to look presentable, even swapping his usual baseball cap for a quick comb-through of his hair in the mirror before leaving home. Still, as his eyes scanned the racks of navy, charcoal, and black, he could feel the stares subtle from some, not so subtle from others. A sales associate behind the counter looked up from folding silk ties, her gaze flicking from his sneakers to his face and then away, as if deciding instantly that he wasn't here for anything she'd need to bother with. Another man in a slim fit suit adjusted his cufflinks and muttered something to a coworker before both glanced in Eli's direction. None of it was overt. It was the quiet kind of scrutiny, the sort you could pretend wasn't happening if you wanted to fool yourself. Eli had been on the receiving end of it enough times to know better. From across the floor, a tall man emerged from behind a glass display case. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back with precision, not a strand out of place. The name tag on his lapel read Greg Mallory, store manager. He moved like he owned the air around him, the kind of gait that said rules didn't just apply to other people. They were written for him to enforce. His eyes landed on Eli, the way a spotlight lands on a suspect, pinning him before he'd even done anything. Eli forced himself not to fidget, even as Greg's gaze traveled from his head to his shoes and back again. He took a slow step toward the suits, each hanger spaced perfectly apart, the fabrics catching the soft light in shades of navy and smoke. His fingers itched to feel the weight of the material, to imagine what it would be like to wear something. That made him look like he belonged in a room where decisions were made. Greg adjusted his tie and started walking toward him, a measured pace that made Eli's shoulders tense. The man's expression didn't soften as he approached. If anything, it sharpened, like he was already bracing for trouble. Eli kept his eyes forward, pretending to examine a mannequin dressed in a charcoal three-piece. The jacket was cut close, the lapels narrow. It was exactly the kind of thing he'd pictured when he imagined walking into the event next month, a State Youth Leadership Gala. He'd never been to anything like it, never needed to dress beyond a shirt and tie for school presentations. But this was different. This was the kind of night people remembered. A flicker of excitement rose in him, at the thought only to be smothered when Greg's voice cut into the air between them. "Can I help you?" The words were neutral enough, but the tone wasn't a question. It was an assessment. Eli turned, meeting his eyes, and caught the faint lift of one eyebrow. He'd heard that tone before in convenience stores, at checkout. Counters when the real question wasn't what he was looking for, but why he was here at all. "I'm just looking," Eli said, his voice steady, despite the heat creeping up the back of his neck. Greg's smile was small, tight. "These are our premium selections," he said, gesturing toward the suits like they were artwork behind. Glass they tend to be, on the higher end. His eyes flicked again to Eli's hoodie, his worn backpack strap. Eli nodded once, forcing a polite smile. "It's fine." He stepped closer to the display, letting his fingers brush the edge of a navy blazer sleeve. The fabric was cool and smooth beneath his touch. For a moment, he let himself imagine it fitted to his shoulders, the way it might change how people saw him, but as Greg remained rooted nearby, arms folding across his chest, the fantasy dimmed. Eli knew this wasn't going to be as simple as finding the right size. This man had already decided who he was before he'd spoken a full sentence. And from the way Greg's eyes tracked his every move, Eli could tell this was just the beginning. Eli shifted the strap of his backpack higher on his shoulder and started toward the row of suits along the back wall. The muted hum of conversation from other shoppers filled the space, punctuated by the soft rustle of fabric as an employee adjusted a display. His eyes darted from one mannequin to another, taking in the sharp lines and careful drape of each jacket. He wanted to get closer, to run his hand along the fine wool and see how the colors looked under the lights. But before he could take more than a few steps, Greg Mallory moved to intercept him. The store manager's approach was deliberate, a smooth closing of distance that left Eli with the uneasy sense of being cornered. Greg stopped just short of blocking the aisle entirely, his polished shoes glinting under the recessed lighting. His smile was there, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" "Duh!" The words came out with an edge so faint most people might not catch it. Eli did. It wasn't the friendly offer of assistance you heard when someone genuinely wanted to help. It was more like a checkpoint, a subtle demand to state his business before being allowed to proceed. "I'm just looking," Eli said, keeping his tone even. He didn't drop his gaze, though the temptation to avoid Greg's scrutinizing eyes was strong. Greg nodded slowly, his gaze scanning Eli's hoodie, his jeans, the worn edges of his sneakers. "These suits here," he said, angling his head toward the display Eli had been heading for, "are part of our premium collection. They're an investment." Ta-ta! The pause was calculated, a tiny hook on which to hang doubt. Eli's fingers twitched against his backpack strap, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's fine," he said again, starting to step around him. Greg shifted just enough to keep himself in Eli's path. "If you're looking for something more budget-friendly, we've got a clearance section toward the back, near the entrance you came in from. Still good quality," just he let the sentence trail off. The implication hanging in the air, like a half-finished accusation. Eli felt the heat building in his chest, the slow thrum of frustration at the base of his throat. He had been here less than 5 minutes, and already the man had drawn his conclusions. He thought of the envelope of cash in his back pocket, each bill earned through hours of work cutting grass in the summer heat, clearing driveways in the winter, stacking boxes in the corner stores, stockroom until his back ached. None of it mattered to Greg. All he saw was a kid who didn't belong here. "I'm here for a suit," Eli said, his voice steady but clipped. From this section, Greg's smile widened just slightly, but it wasn't a smile at all. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. He stepped aside, but only enough to let Eli pass under the weight of his gaze. "If you need any guidance, let me know. I'd hate for you to waste time on something that won't work out." Eli didn't answer. He moved toward the display, aware of Greg's presence at his back. The suits hung like a row of quiet sentinels, each tag dangling with a price that made his stomach tighten. But he'd done the math weeks ago. He knew exactly how much he had, and he'd set his sights on a price range that wouldn't leave him completely empty-handed. He reached out toward a dark navy blazer, but before his fingers met the fabric, Greg spoke again from behind him. "That one starts at $600, just so you know." Eli turned his head slightly, catching the faintest smirk on Greg's face. "Thanks," he said flatly, and took the blazer from the rack anyway. The hanger was heavier than he expected, the wool smooth and cool under his fingertips. Greg stayed where he was, arms loosely folded, watching. "Like I said, clearance is just over there," he added casually, as if he were mentioning the weather. Eli took a slow breath and turned fully to face him. "And like I said," he replied, "I'm looking here." For a second, neither of them moved. The hum of the store seemed to fade beneath the quiet friction between them. Greg's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before he gave a small shrug and gestured toward the fitting rooms. "Be my guest," he said, but there was no mistaking the calculation still flickering behind his eyes. Eli turned back to the suits, refusing to let the manager's tone settle in his bones. He was here for a reason, and no amount of suspicion was going to send him to the clearance rack. Not today. Eli eased the navy blazer from the rack, its weight reassuring in his hands. He ran his palm over the fabric, feeling the tight weave, the way it caught the light in deep, almost midnight tones. This was the kind of suit he had imagined when he first heard about the gala, the kind of suit that could make him look like someone worth listening to. He checked the tag, his heart quickening when he saw the price. It was high, but still within the limit he had saved for. The months of odd jobs, the evenings spent sweeping floors at the corner store, the weekends trimming hedges in backyards that weren't his, this was what they had been for. He glanced toward the fitting rooms at the back of the store. They were half hidden behind a wall of mirrors, each doorway marked by a simple brass plaque. The aisle was clear, and he started toward them, the blazer draped neatly over his arm. His stride was careful, deliberate, the way someone walks when they don't want to give anyone a reason to doubt they belong. But halfway there, a shadow slid into his path. Greg Mallory stepped forward, hands clasped loosely in front of him, the smile on his face tighter than the knot in his silk tie. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice carrying a little too easily over the low murmur of the store. "We've got a policy." Eli stopped short, looking up at him. "A policy?" Greg nodded, tilting his head toward the blazer. "Before anyone tries on merchandise from our premium collection, we have to confirm the payment method. It's a standard procedure." The words were smooth, but the way he said them made it clear this wasn't something applied to everyone. D blinked at him. "Confirm the payment method?" "That's right," Greg said, a touch louder now, as if he wanted to be sure the nearby customers caught every syllable. "Just to make sure everything's in order before we have our tailors prep the fitting room." From somewhere to the left, a woman browsing dress shirts glanced up. A man near the tie display paused mid-fold, his eyes flicking toward them. Eli could feel the heat rising in his ears. Greg wasn't just telling him, he was telling everyone. "I've never heard of that," Eli said, keeping his voice steady. "It's not something we advertise," Greg replied, the corners of his mouth twitching upward like he'd just won a point in an invisible game. "But it's store policy, especially for items in that price range." He nodded toward the blazer in Eli's hands, as if to remind him what he was holding. The air seemed to thicken. Eli could feel the weight of other people's attention, the prickle of judgment that came when strangers decided they already knew your story. His grip on the blazer tightened. "I can pay for it," he said quietly. "I'm sure you believe you can," Greg said, and this time he didn't bother lowering his voice. A few more heads turned. "But before we set you up in a room, I need to see either a card we can pre-authorize or cash just to verify." Eli's chest tightened. This wasn't about policy. He knew it. Greg knew it. The way the man's eyes lingered on his hoodie, his sneakers, the worn strap of his backpack, it was all part of the same silent verdict. He swallowed hard, aware of how quiet the aisle had gotten. "And if I don't," Greg shrugged, the picture of professional indifference, "then I can't let you try it on. I'm sure you understand. It's nothing personal. It's nothing personal." The phrase landed like a stone in Eli's gut. Around them, the store kept humming, but the focus had shifted. He could see it in the sidelong glances, the subtle lean of people's bodies toward the exchange. He thought of the envelope of cash in his pocket, the hours he'd worked for it, the sweat and scraped knuckles. He thought of walking away, of leaving the suit behind. But then he thought of the gala, of stepping onto that stage, and something in him refused to back down. He met Greg's eyes and said nothing, his silence heavier than any argument. Greg stood there, still blocking the path, his voice smooth but loud enough to ensure that the moment was branded into everyone's memory. Eli's ears burned, but he kept his shoulders square. He wasn't going to be the one to move first. The space between them seemed to stretch, even though Greg was standing close enough that Eli could see the fine stitching on his lapel. Around them, the quiet in the store had changed. It wasn't the calm hum of shoppers moving between racks. Anymore it was watchful, charged. Eli could feel eyes on him from every direction, each glance adding another layer to the heat building. Under his skin, to his left, a man holding a stack of neatly folded shirts lingered by a display table, pretending to adjust the pile but not looking away. A young couple near the entrance whispered to each other, their eyes flicking from Greg to Eli and back again. Two teenage girls in oversized hoodies stood near the mirror wall, one nudging the other before lifting her phone halfway, angling it as if she was checking her reflection, but keeping the lens pointed at him. Eli's throat tightened, he knew. What those videos would look like, what people online would say without knowing anything about him. But he also knew that walking away right now would make it look like Greg was right, like he had been caught doing something wrong. He wasn't about to hand that to him. It's for an important event, Eli said finally, forcing the words out evenly, shifted the blazer. In his hands, the fabric still draped neatly over one arm. I just need to make sure it fits before I buy it. Greg's smile didn't change, but his eyes did, sharpening, narrowing. Like he'd just been given the opening he was waiting for. And what kind of event is that? He asked, his voice rising just enough to carry to the nearest onlookers. School dance? Job interview? Eli hesitated for half a second before answering. The State Youth Leadership Gala. A few murmurs moved through the small knot of people who had stopped browsing entirely now. Greg tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. That's so? He said, and for a moment it looked like he might step aside. But then he gave a small, dismissive shake of his head. Well, that's nice. Still, maybe you should try somewhere more. In your budget, plenty of places sell suits that'll get the job done. The words hit with deliberate precision. Eli felt them in his chest, the subtle cruelty in the way Greg said, get the job done, as though it didn't matter how he looked, as though he should settle for something that was just good enough. He could hear the faint click of a phone camera. Someone near the tie rack whispered. What's going on? Another voice replied. Manager's not letting him try it on, probably thinks he can't pay. The whisper wasn't quiet enough. Eli caught it, and so did a few others. Their eyes darting between him and Greg like they were watching a match to see who'd break first. I can afford it, Eli said, his voice low but steady. Greg gave a small, almost pitying laugh. Look, kid, I'm trying to save you the trouble. This isn't the clearance rack, and I'd hate for you too. He let the sentence trail off, gesturing vaguely toward the blazer as if the price tag were some insurmountable wall. The pressure in the room was suffocating now. Every second he stood there, Eli could feel his pulse in his temples, the burn of humiliation creeping higher into his face. His grip on the blazer tightened until his knuckles whitened, but his feet stayed planted. Leaving would be easy safe even. But it would also mean carrying this moment home with him, playing it over in his head until the sting turned into something worse. So he didn't move. He kept his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on Greg's, the noise of the store fading into a dull hum around them. He could feel the crowd's curiosity thickening, the phones tilted just enough to capture him from the corner of their screens. If Greg thought the embarrassment would make him back down, he was wrong. Eli wasn't going anywhere. Marcus Reed had been in the store for nearly 20 minutes, moving slowly along the rows of silk ties that hung like banners in a careful spectrum of color. He had no reason to rush. His driver was waiting outside, and his only appointment that afternoon was a late lunch across town. The store was quiet enough that he could hear the muted shuffle of fabric from the tailoring room, the faint tap of a clerk's shoes on the polished floor, and, from a few aisles away, the low but pointed exchange between the store manager and a teenage boy. He didn't turn toward them right away. Years of courtroom work had taught him the value of observing without announcing yourself. Instead, he kept his gaze on the tie rack, his hands brushing over textured stripes and herringbone patterns. But his attention was fixed entirely on the voices carrying through the store. The boy's voice was measured, calm in a way Marcus didn't often hear from someone that young under public scrutiny. The manager's voice, on the other hand, had that particular edge Marcus recognized instantly, the edge of someone certain they had the upper hand and determined to make sure. Everyone in earshot knew it. When Marcus did glance over, it was through the small gap between two displays. The boy stood tall, his grip on a navy blazer tight enough to show the tension in his fingers. He was dressed plainly jeans hoodie, a backpack slung over one shoulder butt. There was a steadiness in his posture that didn't match the way the manager was speaking to him. Most kids would have shifted under that kind of attention, maybe lowered their eyes or tried to shrink from view. This one didn't. Marcus moved down the tie rack, positioning himself where he could see more clearly without stepping into the exchange. He studied the boy's expression. Jaw set, eyes locked on the manager, no flinching, even as more shoppers slowed to watch. The scene had already drawn a small cluster of onlookers, some openly curious, others trying to pretend they weren't. Invested in the outcome, a few held phones low in their hands, recording under the guise of checking messages. The manager Marcus caught the name from the tag. Greg Mallory wasn't making any attempt to keep his voice down. If anything, he seemed to be drawing the moment out, giving the crowd a performance they hadn't asked for. He gestured toward the blazer like it was some fragile artifact and not a piece of clothing meant to be sold. The subtext was loud enough to hear, even without the exact words, "You don't belong here." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same one he used to get watching junior associates be dismissed in conference rooms before they'd even spoken. But he didn't step in. Not yet. He wanted to see how the boy handled himself, how he reacted under the weight of that kind of judgment. There was a difference between someone folding at the first pushback and someone who knew how to plant their feet and hold their ground. The boy spoke again, and though Marcus couldn't catch every word, the tone was clear, respectful but unwilling to concede. That, more than anything, made Marcus watch closer. Composure under pressure was rare, especially when the pressure was public and deliberate. Greg shifted his stance, arms folded now, a faint smirk playing at his mouth, was waiting for the boy to back down. The crowd was waiting too, in that uneasy way people do when they'd rather see an ending than get involved. Marcus slid one last tie back onto the rack and straightened, his hands in his pockets now. His gaze didn't leave the boy. The manager thought he was the one in control of the moment, but Marcus knew better. The real control belonged to the person who decided when and how to respond. And from where Marcus was standing, it looked like the boy wasn't done yet. Greg shifted his weight slightly. One polished shoe angled toward Eli as if cutting off even the possibility of moving past him. The blazer hung from Eli's arm like a question that needed answering, but Greg's eyes weren't on the suit anymore. They were fixed on Eli himself, studying him with the clinical detachment of someone looking for a flaw they could name out loud. "Look," Greg said, his tone just on the edge of cordial, "this is premium merchandise. Before we go any further, I need to see you've got a way to pay for it. Cash or card, doesn't matter. Store policy." It was the second time he'd said those words, but now they felt less like an explanation and more like a challenge. Around them, the small crowd of shoppers lingered in quiet anticipation, space thick with that peculiar kind of interest people have when something uncomfortable is happening that doesn't directly involve them. Eli could hear the faint rustle of someone shifting their weight, the click of a phone camera somewhere behind him. "I told you," Eli said carefully. "I can pay for it." Greg nodded once, almost indulgently. "Then this should be easy. Just show me what you're working with, and we can get you set up in the fitting room." His voice was pitched just high enough for it to carry across the nearest displays, ensuring every eavesdropping customer could hear him. The heat crept up Eli's neck. He hadn't planned on showing anyone the cash knot until he was standing at the register, ready to make the purchase. But Greg wasn't going to let him pass without this little display. And walking away now would mean letting the insinuation stand. Slowly, Eli set the blazer over his arm and reached into his back pocket. His wallet was old, the edges frayed from years of use. The stitching on one side had come loose long ago, but it still did its job. He flipped it open, revealing a neat stack of bills, 20s, 10s, 5s, all carefully counted, saved from every weekend shift and odd job over the last few months. It wasn't a thick wad of cash, but it was enough, and he held it so Greg could see without making a show of it. Greg's eyes dropped to the money, then back to Eli's face. For a moment, there was a flicker of something recognition, maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "That's quite a bit for someone your age," Greg said. The words dipped in feigned surprise. He let out a short, humorless laugh, loud enough to turn more heads. Hope it's not from whatever trouble kids are getting into these days. Eli felt the jab land. He closed his wallet deliberately, sliding it back into his pocket. It's from work, he said, his voice tight. Greg shrugged, the gesture dripping with skepticism. If you say so, you'll have to forgive me for being thorough. We've had incidents before. The implication hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Marcus Reed, still by the tie display, watched the entire exchange without moving, his gaze locked on Eli's face. Others shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Eli kept his chin level, refusing to look away. So, do I get to try it on now? Greg hesitated, as though still deciding whether to push the humiliation further. Then, with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, he stepped slightly to the side. Go ahead, just don't waste my time if it's not the right fit. The words trailed after Eli as he started toward the fitting rooms, the blazer still draped over his arm. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he kept moving. He had proved he could pay. The fact that Greg had turned it into a spectacle wasn't going to be the end of the story. Eli had barely taken 2 steps toward the fitting rooms when Greg's voice cut across the space. Sharper this time, carrying a note of finality. Actually, hold up right there. The words landed like a hand grabbing his shoulder, even though Greg hadn't touched him. Eli turned, the blazer still hanging neatly over his arm, to see the manager tapping a button on the small radio. Clipped to his belt, security to the suit section, Greg said into the mic, his gaze never leaving Eli. Possible violation of store policy. Need an escort. His tone was brisk, official, the way someone might call for assistance with a spill or a broken display routine, except for the weight of the words he chose. Conversations in the store dipped into a sudden hush. The crowd that had been pretending to browse a moment ago now stood more openly in place, their curiosity no longer hidden. Someone near the entrance shifted to get a better view. I could feel the heat in his chest rise, spreading toward his throat. His grip on the blazer tightened until his knuckles ached, and his other hand curled into a fist at his side. He forced his voice to stay level. What are you doing? Greg's expression was maddeningly calm. I'm following procedure. We've had issues with people mishandling merchandise, and I'm not about to take chances. It's nothing personal. He repeated that last phrase like it was a shield, as though saying it made it true. From the far side of the store, 2 security guards began walking toward them. They weren't in a rush, just a steady, measured pace, but their dark uniforms and the radios clipped to their shoulders drew every eye in the room. Greg straightened, clearly satisfied that his point would soon be backed by muscle. Eli's jaw tightened. I haven't done anything wrong, he said, his tone flat, careful. He didn't trust his anger not to spill over if he let it sharpen. Greg spread his hands in a mock gesture of reassurance. Like I said, nothing personal. We just have to be careful about situations. He let the pause hang just long enough for everyone to fill it with their own assumptions. One of the guards arrived first, a tall man with tired eyes who gave Eli a quick glance before looking to Greg. What's the problem? Greg's answer was crisp, rehearsed. Customers insisting on trying premium merchandise without proper verification. Policy states we confirm payment method before allowing fitting. Refused to comply. I didn't refuse, Eli said, turning to face the guard. I showed him the money. The second guard, a shorter woman with a tight braid, looked from Eli to Greg. He showed proof, she asked, her voice neutral but edged with something wary. Greg's smile was thin. At a wad of cash isn't verification. Could be anything. The taller guard's gaze lingered on Eli for a moment, then drifted to the customers standing nearby. The air was thick with discomfort, people staring without speaking, shifting under the tension like they knew this was headed somewhere it shouldn't. Marcus Reed was still in place by the tie display, his posture deceptively casual, but his eyes stayed locked on Eli. The shorter guard finally spoke. Do you want us to escort him out? Yes, Greg said, without hesitation. We'll avoid unnecessary disruption. Eli's fists clenched tighter, but his voice came out steady. I came here to buy a suit, that's all. Neither guard moved right away. The hesitation was clear now, a beat too long to be purely procedural. The taller one glanced at his partner, then back at Greg. Maybe we just keep an eye from a distance. Let's not make a scene unless it's necessary. Greg's jaw twitched. This is necessary, he said, but his voice had lost a shade of its confidence. The guards exchanged a look, then stepped back a few paces instead of closing in. Eli stayed where he was, shoulders squared, his grip on the blazer unshaken. He wasn't going to let Greg push him out, not with half the store watching. If Greg thought calling security would intimidate him into leaving, he'd just made the wrong move. Eli stood still for a long moment, the noise of the store fading into a kind of muffled hum in his ears. He could feel the crowd's attention, pressing in, their eyes waiting for him to either lash out or walk away. Greg's posture remained stiff, his arms folded, the smug assurance still in his stance even if the edges had begun to fray after security hadn't removed him on the spot. Slowly, Eli loosened his clenched fist and shifted the blazer to one arm. He reached back into his pocket, pulled out his wallet again, and this time didn't bother holding the cash up for inspection. Instead, he slid the bills back into their slot with deliberate care, as though closing the book on that part of the conversation. His movements were unhurried, steady. He wasn't rushing to comply or to leave. From another section of the store, someone coughed. Lightly, the sound loud in the quiet. Greg's eyes tracked Eli's every motion, waiting for the next move, maybe expecting some sort of apology or another attempt to plead his case. But Eli had something else in mind. He reached into the other side of his wallet and pulled out a small, neatly folded sheet of paper, creased in thirds like it had been tucked away for safekeeping. He held it between two fingers, not offering it yet, just letting the white edges stand out against the deep navy of the blazer draped over his arm. "Does this name mean anything to you?" he asked, his tone calm, but with a faint edge that made a few nearby shoppers lean forward without realizing it. Greg's gaze dropped to the paper, then flicked back up to Eli's face, the first shadow of uncertainty crossing his features. "What is it?" Eli didn't answer directly. He stepped forward just enough to hold the paper out, unfolding it halfway so the bold text in the center was visible. The lighting from the overhead fixtures caught on the clean white surface, drawing the eye to the printed name and formal serif type. Greg's frown was small at first, just the tightening of his mouth, but it deepened as his eyes scanned the words. For the first time since the exchange began, his composure wavered. It was quick, just a moment, but it was there. His eyebrows drew together slightly, and his jaw shifted like he was recalibrating mid-sentence. He looked back at Eli, his voice lacking the crisp confidence from before. "Where did you get this?" "Doesn't matter," Eli said, his tone still level. "Just wanted to know if you recognized it." Greg hesitated, glancing briefly toward the guards who had stepped back to give space, but were still close enough to hear. He didn't answer, which was enough of an answer for Eli. The flicker of recognition had already given him away. From Eli, his place by the tie display, Marcus Reed's attention sharpened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the exchange. A few customers exchanged low murmurs, sensing that something had shifted in the dynamic, even if they didn't know exactly. "What?" Greg's mouth opened like he might press for an explanation, but no words came. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "That's not relevant to the matter at hand." It sounded weak even to his own ears. Why folded the paper back along its creases and slipped it into his wallet. He wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way he moved. Like he'd just reminded Greg that the story unfolding here might not be as simple as he thought. "Then I guess we're done with the payment conversation," Eli said evenly, his voice carrying just enough for the closest onlookers to hear. Greg didn't respond right away. The confidence in his stance was still there, but it no longer looked unshakable. The crowd could feel the tension shift, and though no one stepped forward, the air between them now held a different kind of weight, less about whether Eli belonged here, more about what Greg might be hiding from. For a long, loaded moment, the paper stayed in Eli's hand, folded tight again, as if he had put the conversation back in his pocket. Greg's eyes still carried that faint, unsettled frown, but before either of them could speak, a new presence broke the standoff. The steady sound of approaching footsteps came from the side aisle, measured and unhurried, but with a certainty that made people instinctively shift to let the man through. Marcus Reed stepped into the open space between them, his charcoal suit catching the soft overhead light, his polished shoes whispering against the floor. He wasn't holding anything but his own calm, and yet his arrival seemed to draw the attention of everyone in the immediate area. His gaze moved briefly from Greg to Eli, and without asking permission, he extended his hand toward the boy. "May I?" Marcus's voice was smooth, but carried the kind of quiet authority that wasn't looking for a yes, it was assuming one. Eli hesitated only a second before placing the folded sheet into Marcus's palm. The man opened it with deliberate care, smoothing the creases as though it were a legal document in a courtroom. Then, in a voice that carried easily across the small crowd without ever sounding raised, he read the words printed there. "Invitation to the State Youth Leadership Gala?" Marcus began, his tones steady and clear. His eyes flicked briefly to Eli before continuing. "Honoree, Elijah Parker." The syllables hung in the air, landing on the ears of every shopper within range. There was a beat of silence, and then the reaction began, a low ripple of murmurs, the kind that comes when a room collectively realizes it has been watching the wrong story unfold. "Honoree." Someone whispered, "Near the shoe display? That's him?" Another voice added from by the shirts, quieter but tinged with surprise. The two teenage girls with their phones exchanged a look, one raising her eyebrows as if to confirm she'd gotten the whole thing recorded. Greg's expression shifted in small, telling ways. His mouth stayed in that neutral, customer service line, but his eyes betrayed the calculation happening behind them. He glanced at Marcus, then at the paper in his hands, and finally back at Eli. "That's impressive," he said, but it came out flat, lacking any genuine warmth. Marcus didn't look at Greg yet. He kept his focus on Eli, handing the paper back with a slight nod. "That's not the kind of honor they hand out to just anyone," he said. His voice was even, but there was an undercurrent there, something quietly acknowledging that he understood exactly what had been happening here. Eli took the paper and slipped it back into his wallet, the murmurs still alive in the space around them. His heart was beating hard, but not from the humiliation anymore. The center of gravity in the room had shifted, and he could feel it. Marcus finally turned his attention to Greg, his expression polite but unreadable. "I'm sure you weren't aware," he said, each word placed with precision, "that you were questioning the ability of a state-recognized honoree to purchase a suit for the very event where he'll be celebrated." Greg's jaw moved like he was about to respond, but nothing came out right away. He settled for, as I said before, store policy is flexible when applied with judgment. Marcus interrupted gently, his tone not rising but cutting. All the same, he let the silence after that stretch just long enough to make Greg shift on his feet. The customers who had been half-watching were now fully engaged, their earlier amusement or detachment replaced by a kind of subdued anticipation. The guards who had been called over stood a few paces back, their eyes moving between the three men, but making no move to intervene. Eli didn't speak. He didn't have to. Invitation had said enough, and Marcus's voice had done the rest. In the quiet that followed, the balance of the encounter no longer felt stacked against him. For the first time since walking through those glass doors, it felt like Greg might be the one deciding whether to step back, rather than Eli deciding whether to stand his ground. Greg's laugh came out thin, brittle, the kind of sound that tried to pass as casual but cracked under its own weight. "Policy's policy," he said, lifting his hands in a mock shrug. "Applies to everyone. Doesn't matter who you are or what kind of event you're attending." He let his gaze skim over the watching faces in the crowd as though seeking agreement from strangers who hadn't been part of the conversation until now. Marcus didn't move right away. He stood there, the silence settling around him like a deliberate pause in cross-examination, the kind that made people lean forward in their seats. When he finally did take a step forward, it wasn't aggressive just enough to close the distance, enough to shift the air between them. His voice, when it came, was calm but resonant, each syllable placed with the care of someone accustomed to rooms where every word mattered. "Tell me, Mr. Mallory," Marcus said, using the name from Greg's tag, "are you always this thorough when an invited honoree from the State Youth Leadership Gala comes in to make a purchase?" The question was simple, but it landed with the weight of something heavier. Greg's mouth opened, but Marcus didn't give him the room to answer just yet. Or he continued, his eyes steady, "Is this a special case?" The words hung there, sharper than the tone in which they were delivered. Around them, the low murmur in the crowd hushed again. The implication was clear enough that even those who hadn't followed every moment of the exchange understood what was being asked. Greg's smile faltered, his eyes darting briefly toward the two security guards still lingering nearby. "Like I said," he repeated, softer now, "policy's policy. We verify for everyone." Marcus didn't flinch. "Good then, I assume. You have similar documentation for the last customer you escorted to a fitting room, and the one before that." His voice never rose, but there was a certain kind of steel underneath it, the kind that didn't need volume to be heard. Greg hesitated, the pause stretching just long enough to be noticed. "We handle each customer on a case-by-case basis," he said finally. Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Case-by-case basis," he echoed, like he was turning the phrase over. In his mind, so not quite the same for everyone then? A few quiet laughs slipped out from the edge of the crowd, quickly stifled. Greg's face tightened, a faint flush creeping up his neck. He tried to stand taller, to hold on to the authority. He'd been projecting all along, but it was clear the dynamic had shifted. Eli stood silent. Beside Marcus, watching the back and forth with a steady gaze, the heat that had been simmering in his chest since the beginning had cooled into something else, an awareness that the balance in the room no longer leaned against him. Greg cleared his throat. "I'm just doing my job." "Oh, I'm sure you believe you are," Marcus said. "But a job done properly doesn't single out one customer over another without cause. Especially not one whose presence at an event like this reflects on the very community you're part of." The sentence was measured, but its weight was undeniable. Greg glanced toward the crowd again, but where before he might have found silent alleys, he now found only eyes watching, waiting to see if he'd step back or double down. The taller security guard shifted his stance, looking at Greg like he was ready for this to be over. The shorter one kept her gaze on Eli, her expression unreadable, but her posture less tense than it had been when she first arrived. Greg exhaled. Slowly, his shoulders dropping a fraction. "If you'd like to try on the suit," he said almost grudgingly, "we can arrange that." Marcus didn't smile, but there was a quiet finality in the way he stepped back, giving Eli the space that had been denied him from the moment he walked in. The crowd didn't cheer or clap. They simply dispersed a little, the tension that had held them in place beginning to loosen. But the shift in the air was impossible to ignore. For the first time that afternoon, Eli felt the path to the fitting. Rooms open in front of him, not because Greg had allowed it, but because the balance of the moment had turned. Marcus didn't move right away after Greg's grudging offer to let Eli into the fitting room. The crowd had begun to loosen, but their attention hadn't wandered far. There was a hum of low conversation around the edges, the kind of unsettled buzz that followed an argument that didn't feel entirely resolved. Marcus let the moment breathe for a few seconds, then straightened his jacket and turned toward Greg, his voice carrying just enough to reach more than just the man in front of him. "Since we're all here," he began, his tone calm but edged. "With something deliberate, I should probably introduce myself." His gaze held Greg's for a fraction longer than was comfortable before sweeping the immediate area. More people paused in their browsing, their heads turning slightly toward the sound. "My name is Marcus Reed," he said, and though the words were plain, there was a ripple through the listeners, as if some recognized the name. "I'm a civil rights attorney. Spent the better part of 20 years in courtrooms and community halls across this state, working on cases where fairness wasn't just ignored, was denied." Let that settle for a breath. "And next month, I'll be the keynote speaker at the State Youth Leadership Gala." Greg blinked, his jaw tightening as Marcus continued. "I also happen to serve on the board that selects our honorees." "Which means," he said, his eyes flicking toward Eli with a faint note of pride, "I was in the room when we voted to recognize Eli Parker for his work in youth advocacy and mentorship programs.
Ow.
I know exactly why he's receiving that honor. I know the hours he's put in, the kids he's guided, the difference he's made in his own community before he's even graduated high school." The murmurs started again, but they weren't the same as before. These were laced with surprise. A few nods passing between strangers, The tension had shifted from curiosity about a confrontation to the weight of what was being revealed. Marcus's voice stayed steady, even warm, but there was a current under it. What I just witnessed here is precisely why young men like Elijah deserve this recognition. Because too often they walk into spaces where their value is questioned. Before they've even spoken, where they have to prove themselves over and over, even when they've already done more than enough to earn their place. Greg shifted his weight, his fingers brushing at an invisible crease in his sleeve. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes kept darting to the faces around them, registering that the tide of opinion was no longer leaning in his favor. Marcus glanced around the immediate area, not looking for applause, just making sure his words found their mark. This isn't about a suit, it's about a habit. One I've seen my whole career of assuming the worst about someone because of what they look like, what they're wearing, or where you've decided they fit in the world. And the damage of that habit doesn't just stick to the person you're judging, it sticks to the whole community. Eli stood still, listening. There was no gloating in his expression, no smirk at seeing Greg squirm. Just that same steady, calm, the same composure he'd held from the beginning. Marcus finally turned back fully to Greg. I don't know how you plan to handle customers going forward, he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. But you'd be wise to remember that every person who walks through that door is carrying a story you can't see. And sometimes, that story is a lot bigger than you realize. Greg swallowed once, his Adam's apple shifting. Understood, he said, but the words were thin, and Marcus didn't push him for more. The moment lingered a beat longer, the surrounding space thick with the weight of what had just been said. Then Marcus stepped aside, giving Eli a nod toward the fitting rooms. The unspoken message was clear. The point had been made and the path was open. It was as if someone had flipped a switch in the room. The air, which only minutes ago had been thick with judgment and suspicion, felt suddenly charged with a different kind of energy. Conversations that had been frozen in mid-sentence started to taper off. The customers who had been holding their phones low, slyly recording or snapping pictures, began tucking them away as though they didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of what was unfolding. Even the employees behind the counter to young sales associates, who had been avoiding eye contact for most of the confrontation, were now glancing toward Greg with a nervous wariness. Their earlier detachment replaced by something that looked a lot like doubt. Greg's stance had changed too. The rigid, squared shoulders had softened, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, as if the ground under him had become less certain. His smile, once fixed in that carefully managed customer service shape, had all but disappeared, replaced by a thin line that betrayed the tension in his jaw. He kept looking toward Marcus, then toward Eli, but the easy authority he had carried minutes ago was gone. Marcus, however, didn't press forward in triumph. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly in his pocket, his voice even and unhurried when he spoke again. I'll take care of it, he said, his eyes on Greg, but his words meant for everyone in earshot. I'll personally pay for the suit. A few heads turned toward Eli, some expectant, others curious. The offer carried the weight of finality, a closing gesture from someone who had not only shifted the room's perception, but taken control of it entirely. Greg nodded quickly, almost in relief, as if this resolution would allow him to sidestep whatever damage had already been done. But before anyone could move toward the register, Eli's voice cut through the space. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, clear enough to halt the small momentum that had started toward wrapping things up. I came prepared to buy it myself, he said. The words didn't carry defiance so much as quiet insistence, but they landed with unexpected force. Marcus turned his head toward him, eyebrows lifting slightly, the faintest glint of respect in his expression. And a ripple of renewed attention passed through the onlookers. Eli shifted the blazer on his arm, his posture straight. I've been saving for this for months, working weekends after school. This is something I've earned, and I'm going to pay for it. He didn't look at Greg when he said it. He didn't need to. The statement was less about who had been standing in his way and more about who he had been all along. Marcus studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. Fair enough, he said. It wasn't a withdrawal of support, but an acknowledgmenta. Recognition that the power in this moment wasn't about who could afford the suit, but about whose story it belonged to. Greg's gaze flicked between them, the subtle flush creeping up his neck again. Whatever relief he'd felt at Marcus's offer had been replaced with the awkward reality that Eli's insistence made his earlier assumptions look even smaller. The store felt different now, because of any one dramatic act, but because the authority in the room had shifted entirely away from him. The other staff, sensing it too, moved quietly about their tasks, their glances quick and uneasy. The crowd, no longer feeding off the tension of a confrontation, had settled into a different kind of watchfulness, as if they understood that what came next would say more about Eli than anything that had come before. Eli adjusted the strap of his backpack and took a slow step toward the fitting rooms, the blazer still in his hands. The space in front of him opened naturally this time, no one standing in his way. And though Marcus remained nearby, ready, if needed, there was no mistaking who was leading the moment now. Marcus let the silence between them stretch just long enough to settle, then glanced toward the counter at the front of the store. His voice, calm but carrying, broke the quiet. "Why don't we all walk to the register together? That way there's no confusion, no more policy checks to get in the way of a purchase." It wasn't a question, and the suggestion was framed as if it were in everyone's best interest. But there was something in the way he said. It measured, almost ceremonial, that made it feel like more than just a trip to pay for a suit. It was a statement, one everyone in the store would bear witness to. Eli looked at him for a beat, reading the offer for what it was. Not a rescue, but a guardrail. A way to make sure the next steps happened in the open, where no one could twist them. He gave a small nod. "All right." Marcus gestured toward the front, and they began moving together. Eli carried the blazer draped over one arm, his other hand tucked into the strap of his backpack. Marcus walked a half-step behind him, his presence quiet but undeniable. One of the security guards fell in just to the side, not close enough to feel like an escort, but close enough that the path stayed clear. Greg didn't lead them, he stayed, where he was for a moment too long, as though hoping the movement toward the counter might dissolve without him. But when he realized the attention in the room was still locked squarely on him, he forced himself into motion, trailing behind instead of taking the front. His earlier briskness was gone. His steps had lost their snap, each one sounding heavier than the last. The walk through the store was slow, deliberate, no one hurried. Conversations in the aisles faltered as shoppers paused to watch. Even those who had tried to look busy earlier now stood still, their eyes following the small procession toward the register. It wasn't the kind of spectacle filled with shouting or dramatic gestures. This was quieter, heavier, the sort of moment that pulled focus because of its weight, not its volume. Eli could feel the eyes on him, but they didn't burn the way they had before. These weren't the sharp, appraising glances he'd felt when Greg first stopped him. This attention carried something different, a recognition, maybe even a subtle current of respect. Greg, on the other hand, seemed to shrink a little more with each step. His hands, once confidently clasped in front of him, now fidgeted at his sides. He avoided looking at the customers who had been closest during the earlier confrontation. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, though he seemed to focus more on the floor than anything else. When they reached the counter, the two young associates, standing behind it, straightened instinctively. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a neat twist, looked from Eli to Greg, her eyes questioning but silent. The other, a tall man with a narrow tie, shifted awkwardly, as though unsure whether to greet them in the usual cheery tone. Marcus stepped slightly to the side, making it clear this was Eli's transaction to complete. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low but steady. Eli set the blazer on the counter, smoothing the sleeve as if to give it one last look. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his worn wallet, and began counting the bills he had saved. Each note was unfolded and stacked with care, his movements unhurried. The faint sound of paper against wood was loud in the quiet space. Greg stood off to one side, his posture stiff, saying nothing. The crowd hadn't dispersed completely. A few lingered near the front, pretending to browse the accessories while keeping the scene in their periphery. No one pulled out a phone now. The moment didn't need recording to be remembered. It was already etched into the air between them. When the last bill was placed on the counter, the associate rang it up without hesitation. There were no questions, no further policy delays. The register's beep sounded almost sharp in the quiet, followed by the soft tear of the receipt. Eli took it, folded it once, and tucked it into his wallet. He picked up the bag containing his new suit, the handle firm in his grip. For the first time since stepping into the store, he allowed himself a breath that felt full. The walk to the register had been slow, yes, but it had been his, and everyone had seen it. The counter was wide and gleaming, a polished surface that reflected the overhead lights in a clean, unbroken line. Eli set the navy blazer down carefully, smoothing its sleeve so it wouldn't crease. His fingers lingered there for a moment, tracing the fabric in one last silent check that it was exactly what he wanted. Then, without looking at anyone else, he reached for his wallet. The leather was worn and softened from years of use, the stitching frayed at the edges. Eli flipped it open and drew out the stack of bills he had guarded for months. They weren't crisp. Some were slightly crumpled, others faded from passing through too many hands before reaching his. But to him, they were more than just money. They were hours of work, of bending his back over push mowers in the summer heat, clearing driveways in the biting cold, of carrying grocery bags up narrow apartment staircases until his arms ached. He began laying them down on the counter one by one, 20, 40, 60. Each note landed with the quiet slap of paper against wood, the sound measured and deliberate. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of him trying to get it over with. He was making a point not to the crowd that still lingered in the periphery, not even to Marcus, but to himself. Every bill was proof that he had earned the right to be here. The young associate behind the register kept her eyes on the money, her hands moving to straighten the bills into a neat pile as he continued. The man beside her keyed in the amount on the register, the soft beeps marking the rhythm of the exchange. No one spoke. When the final bill was set down, the associate gave a small nod and began counting it in front of him. Her voice was low, almost respectful, as she confirmed the total. She slid the pile toward her coworker, who tucked it neatly into the cash drawer and closed it with a quiet click. The receipt printed out with a faint mechanical hum, the paper curling as it emerged. The associate tore it free and placed it on the counter. Before Eli could reach for it, Marcus stepped forward. He took a sleek white business card from the inside pocket of his jacket and with deliberate care set it directly on top of the receipt. The card looked sharp against the pale paper, his name embossed in clean black lettering. The weight of the cardstock unmistakably professional. "Call me tomorrow," Marcus said, his tone calm but leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Have something I'd like to discuss with you." Eli glanced down at the card, then up at Marcus. There was no hint of charity in his voice, no sense that this was a favor to be repaid. It was an opening, extended without strings in that moment, though Eli could feel the importance of it all the same. Behind them, Greg stood slightly to the side, his posture rigid, but his face drained of the earlier bluster. The pallor in his cheeks was stark against the sharp lines of his jaw. He kept his eyes fixed somewhere over Eli's shoulder, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, as though looking directly at the scene would cement his part in it. Eli picked up the receipt with Marcus's card still resting on top. Tucking both into his wallet with the same deliberate care he had used to count out his money, the bag containing the suit sat on the counter, its glossy paper catching the light. He looped the handle over his wrist, the weight of it solid and real. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of tissue paper inside the bag. Eli stepped back from the counter, his shoulders straight. The transaction was done, paid in full, on his own terms. Whatever else had happened in the store that afternoon, this was how it ended, with his money, his purchase, and a card in his wallet that might change more than just the fit of a suit. By the time Eli made it home, the sun was dipping low, painting the neighborhood in soft gold. He set the suit bag on his bed, the navy fabric inside resting neatly against its paper lining. For the first time all day, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. But as he reached for his phone, it vibrated in his hand, one notification after another flashing across the screen. He opened the first message from a classmate. "Dude, you're on Instagram." Another followed almost immediately. "Is this you at Belamonte's?" A link came through, and with a sinking feeling mixed strangely with curiosity, Eli tapped it. The video started mid-confrontation. Someone's phone angled just enough to capture him standing with the blazer over his arm and Greg blocking his path. The audio was muffled at first, but clear enough to hear Greg's voice, firm and insistent. "About store policy and verification?" Then came Marcus stepping into frame, his voice steady as he read the words on that folded paper. "Invitation to the State Youth Leadership Gala honoree, Eli Parker." At the clip cut there, just... As the murmurs began, even without the full context, it was enough. When Eli scrolled down, he saw that this was only one of several angles circulating. Another video caught the slow walk to the register, Greg trailing behind, shoulders tight. In that one, someone had added text across the top. "This is how you stand your ground." Others zoomed in on Marcus handing Eli his card, framing it as a cinematic ending to an uncomfortable scene. The comment sections were a flood. Half of them seethed with outrage at Greg's behavior, people condemning the way he'd treated Eli, calling for the store to take action. And words like profiling and discrimination came up again and again. Some commenters claimed they'd had similar experiences at high-end stores, their stories adding to the chorus of frustration. The other half of the comments focused on Eli himself. Strangers admired how calm he'd stayed, how he hadn't raised his voice or stormed out. They called him composed, classy, and someone to watch. A few even said they were looking forward to hearing his speech at the gala, asking if it would be live-streamed. By late evening, the videos had spread beyond Instagram. Twitter threads dissected the moment frame by frame, pairing screenshots with captions that alternated between sharp criticism of Greg and praise for Eli. On TikTok, the clips were set to music, some edited into quick, dramatic montages, others slowed down to emphasize Marcus's entrance and the reading of the invitation. It didn't take long for the store's name to start trending. That was when a new post caught Eli's screenshot of an official statement from the corporate account. It was short, impersonal, and carefully worded. "Belamonte Clothiers is aware of an incident at one of our retail locations earlier. Today, we take these matters seriously and are currently reviewing the details. Our commitment to providing a welcoming environment for all customers remains our top priority." There was no mention of him by name, no admission of wrongdoing, just the standard corporate phrasing that said everything and nothing at once. The comments under that post were ruthless, with people accusing the company of sidestepping the real issue. Eli stared at the screen for a long moment, then set his phone down. He wasn't sure how he felt, part of him still raw from the day's events. Part of him strangely detached from the noise now swirling around his name. He knew this kind of attention could vanish as quickly as it had come. But he also knew the moment in that store had been real, and no amount of corporate distancing could change that. Outside, the last light was fading, but inside, the suit bag on his bed seemed to hold a different kind of weight, now not just fabric and thread, but the story that had traveled farther than he ever expected. The air outside the city hall carried the faint bite of early spring, cool enough that Eli felt it through the thin fabric of his dress shirt as he stepped out of the car. The street was lined with tall glass doors that spilled warm light onto the pavement, and the sound of voices drifted out in soft waves, layered with the occasional sharp burst of laughter. A red carpet stretched from the curb to the entrance, flanked by small ropes and clusters of photographers whose cameras clicked and flashed in quick practiced rhythms. Eli adjusted the lapels of his navy suit. It fit perfectly now, the jacket resting against his shoulders as if it had been made for him. His mother had helped him tie the deep burgundy silk tie that morning, her hands trembling slightly as she worked the knot. She'd stepped back after and smiled in that quiet way she had, her eyes telling him more than words could manage. Now, under the bright lights outside the gala, he felt the weight of that moment more than the weight of the eyes on him. Stepped onto the carpet, a few cameras turned his way, their shutters clicking in bursts. He kept his chin level, his stride steady, not rushing despite the flicker of nerves in his stomach. Near the entrance, Marcus Reed stood in a tailored charcoal suit, one hand in his pocket. The other lifted in a small wave as soon as he spotted Eli. "You clean up well," Marcus said. When Eli reached him, his tone warm but laced with that same quiet authority he'd carried in the store weeks ago. Eli smiled, a brief, genuine curve of his mouth. "Thanks for being here." "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. "Come on, there are people you should meet before you go on stage." Inside the lobby was a sweep of polished marble and high ceilings, the air humming with the layered conversations of officials, business leaders, and past honorees. Wait staff moved between clusters of guests, carrying trays of champagne and sparkling water. Marcus navigated the space with practiced ease, pausing every few steps to greet someone and pull Eli into the introduction. "This is Elijah Parker," Marcus would say, and each time Eli shook a new hand, he felt the repetition of his own name sinking into the room. Faces he'd only ever seen in news segments or on the covers of local magazines now turned their attention to him. Some congratulated him outright. Others asked questions about his work, leaning in as he spoke about the youth mentorship programs he'd helped organize at school. In one corner, a photographer asked for a photo of them together. Marcus stepped aside so Eli could stand in the center of the frame, the navy suit catching the light in just the right way. The flash went off once, twice, before they moved on. As they wove through the crowd, Eli caught glimpses of the main hall through the open doors of stage at the far end, rows of chairs filled with guests, the soft glow of spotlights warming the backdrop. A banner hung above the stage, State Youth Leadership Gala, celebrating tomorrow's leaders. When they reached a quiet pocket near the side entrance, Marcus checked his watch. 10 minutes, he said. "You ready?" Eli nodded, though. His pulse was steady in that heightened way it gets before stepping into something big. "Yeah, I think so," good Marcus said. "Remember, they already believe in you. Tonight's just about letting them see why." Eli looked toward the stage again. The room beyond was alive with light and movement, but all he could think about was the sheet of paper in his pocket, his speech folded neatly. In thirds, he'd gone over it enough times that he barely needed to look at it, but it was there, a safety net, just in case. Somewhere out there, beyond the crowd and the cameras, people would hear his story without the interruptions, without the weight of suspicion hanging over it. For now, that was all he focused on, the words he was about to speak and the fact that, in this moment, he belonged exactly where he was standing. The MC's voice echoed gently through the hall as Eli's name was announced, the word State Youth Leadership Gala honoree rolling out like a banner he had to step beneath. The spotlight followed him as he walked across the stage, the soft murmur of the audience fading into stillness. His shoes clicked against the polished wood floor, the sound sharp in the quiet. When he reached the podium, he paused for a moment, letting his eyes sweep over the room. Rows of faces looked back at him, students in their own carefully chosen outfits. Community leaders, local officials, and scattered among them, people he recognized from television or newspaper photos. Marcus sat near the front, his posture relaxed, but his gaze fixed firmly on Eli. That steady presence was enough to anchor him. Eli unfolded the sheet of paper in his hands, but didn't look at it right away. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying through the hall, a touch steadier than he'd expected. "I want to tell you a story. It's not about the award I'm holding tonight or the work I've been lucky enough to do in my community. It's about a suit." A small ripple of interest moved through the audience. He took a slow breath and continued. "For the past several months, I've been saving to buy my first one. I worked weekends mowing lawns, cleared snow in the winter, carried groceries for neighbors, and stocked shelves at the corner store after school. Every dollar went into a worn old wallet until I had enough to walk into a store and pick something I could be proud to wear tonight." He glanced briefly toward Marcus before going on. "When I got there, I found the one I wanted in navy suit. But before I could even try it on, I was stopped. I was told there was a policy that I needed to prove. I could pay before touching what they called premium merchandise." A murmur rolled through the room. Eli's tone stayed even, his words measured. I could feel people watching. Some turned away, some smirked, some recorded it on their phones. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about a suit. It was about what I looked like to someone else. It was about assumptions made before I'd spoken more than a sentence. He rested one hand lightly on the podium, the paper still in his other. I'm not telling you this to shame the man who stopped me. I'm telling you because moments like that happen every day in ways big and small. Every time they do, they take something from people, not just the chance to buy a suit or walk into a store, but something far more important: dignity. The word seemed to settle in the air. Dignity, he repeated, isn't about titles or awards or what's in your bank account. It's about being seen and treated as a human being, without having to prove your worth before you've even had the chance to show who you are. He let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, his eyes moving across the room. The truth is, dignity costs nothing to give. But the absence of it can be more expensive than we realize, costing trust. Costing trust, opportunity, and the belief that we all have a place in the same room. Eli straightened slightly. Tonight I stand here in that navy suit. I paid for it with my own money, the same way I earned my place at this gala through hard work and persistence. But I also stand here because someone saw what was happening and decided to step in. That taught me something too, that we have a responsibility to speak up when we see dignity being stripped away from someone else. He folded the paper quietly, though he hadn't looked at it once. So my hope is that when you leave here tonight, you'll remember that what you say or do in a moment might be the difference between someone feeling invisible and someone feeling valued. You may not remember their name, but they'll remember yours. For a second, the room was utterly still. Then, as he stepped back from the podium, the applause began, scattered at first, then rising into a full standing ovation. The sound filled the hall, warm and unbroken, wrapping around him in a way that felt larger than the stage, larger than the suit, larger than the day in the store. It was a sound that carried the weight of recognition and the promise that his words had found their mark. Greg sat in his small office at the back of the store, the blinds half drawn against the afternoon light. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence, interrupted only by the occasional muted ping of his computer as new emails landed in his inbox. Most of them carried subject lines: he didn't want to open incident follow-up, urgent, media inquiry, HR, scheduled meeting. He had already read enough over the last few days to know exactly where things were heading. It hadn't stopped. If anything, the attention had grown louder. The first few videos of the incident had been bad enough. But after the gala, new clips started circulating Eli in that navy suit, speaking to a standing room audience about dignity, his words cutting through the noise with a calm authority Greg hadn't expected. The moment Marcus had read out, Eli's invitation was now being replayed alongside the applause from the gala, side by side. The two scenes told a story that painted Greg as a man who had stood in the way of something bigger than a purchase. Corporate had called him in twice that week. The first meeting had been stiff, formal, with his regional manager sitting across the table and an HR representative taking notes. They'd asked him to walk them through what had happened. His version of events? He'd used the word policy more times than he could count, leaning on it like a lifeline, but the looks they exchanged made it clear it wasn't enough. By the second meeting, the tone had shifted. There were fewer questions and more statements, phrases like reputational harm and brand image and loss of consumer trust. They told him the company had been flooded with messages from customers demanding action. Some had sworn off shopping at Belamonte's altogether. Others shared their own experiences of feeling unwelcome or scrutinized in stores. Greg had tried to defend himself, to say that he'd been following the rules, that he hadn't meant anything by it. But each explanation seemed smaller than the one before, paling against the weight of the coverage now attached to his name. The video clips had stripped away the possibility of subtlety. People didn't see policy. They saw a man blocking a 17-year-old from trying on a suit because he didn't believe he belonged in it. The official notice came on a Thursday morning, slipped into his inbox with the bland efficiency of corporate procedure. His position was being terminated, effective immediately, accompanied by a severance package and a request to return all company property by the end of the day. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public escort out the door, just a quiet, administrative severing that left him alone in his office, staring at the bland language of finality. By Friday, the company released a press statement to the public. It was longer than their initial response, but still careful in its phrasing. They acknowledged that the incident did not reflect the values of Belamonte clothiers and announced that, effective immediately, all employees would undergo comprehensive anti-bias training. The announcement was accompanied by a smiling stock photo of a diverse group of staff. It's a kind of image meant to convey progress without dwelling on the reason it was suddenly necessary. The media picked up on it quickly, folding the statement into articles about Eli's speech and the viral moment that had sparked it all. Reporters used words like restructuring and policy overhaul, though Greg knew the store itself hadn't changed much in the week since. The staff still rang up customers, straightened displays, and folded clothes just like before. But now, every employee had a calendar invite for a mandatory training session. The corporate emails spoke in a tone of urgent self-awareness. Greg packed up his office in less than an hour. A few framed certificates, a desk clock, a small potted plant he'd kept alive against the odds. As he carried the box through the store, he could feel the eyes of his staff following him, not gloating, not pitying, just watching. The air felt thinner than it had before, each step toward the exit strangely loud. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the racks of neatly pressed suits under the soft glow of the lights. The navy ones were still there, lined up just as they had been the day Eli walked in. But now, even Greg could see that the room felt different. The story had already left these walls, and no amount of silence inside them could take it back. Eli was sitting at his desk, his homework spread out in uneven stacks, when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't one he recognized, but the area code made him pause. He let it ring twice more before swiping to answer, his voice cautious. On the other end, Marcus's calm baritone carried the same grounded authority it had the day they met in the store. He didn't start with small talk. Instead, he told Eli he had been thinking about what happened, not just the suit, but the way Eli had handled himself when it would have been easier to walk away. Explained that his legal foundation had a summer internship program. Usually it was reserved for college students, but he was making an exception. He said he needed people on his team who understood what it meant to stand their ground under pressure, people who could look past the heat of a moment and still choose dignity. His voice held no hint of condescension. It wasn't charity and it wasn't a test. It was an offer. Eli leaned back in his chair, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling above his bed as Marcus spoke. The idea of working at a legal foundation was so far from anything he had imagined for the summer. He had planned to keep mowing lawns, maybe pick up extra hours at the grocery store. But this was different. Marcus talked about community outreach projects, research assistants, and shadowing attorneys as they prepared cases. He described how they often worked with youth advocacy groups and how having someone closer to their age could bridge gaps they hadn't been able to close before. For a moment, Eli didn't say anything. His mind flashed back to the store, the weight of all those stairs, Greg's voice carrying across the room, the way his pulse had pounded in his ears. It had been one of the most humiliating moments of his life, but somehow it was now opening a door he never knew existed. Marcus seemed to sense his hesitation and added, "I'm not asking you to decide right now. Think about it. I'll tell you this, opportunities don't always knock twice. When they do, they don't always wait." Eli promised he'd talk to his mom about it and let Marcus know soon. After they hung up, he sat for a long time with the phone still in his hand. The quiet of his room felt different now, charged with possibility. His desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the open pages of his homework, but he couldn't focus on algebra problems or reading assignments. My mind kept returning to the way Marcus had phrased it: people who know what it's like to stand tall under pressure. Later that evening, he brought it up to his mom while she was rinsing dishes in the kitchen sink. She turned off the water, wiped her hands, and looked at him carefully. He told her everything Marcus had said, watching her face shift from surprise to quiet pride. She reminded him that the past few weeks had been proof he could handle more than most people his age, that this was a chance to see the world beyond his neighborhood, to learn skills no classroom could teach. They sat at the small kitchen table, talking through what it might mean commuting into the city, balancing work with his school responsibilities, meeting people from entirely different walks of life. There were logistics to figure out, sure, but the more they talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't something to turn down lightly. When he finally texted Marcus later that night, the words came simply, "I'm in. Tell me when to start." Marcus's reply came almost instantly. "Monday. Wear the suit." Eli smiled at that, glancing toward the garment bag hanging in his closet. The navy fabric caught just enough of the room's light to remind him of everything that had led to this point. A week ago, the suit had been just a goal. I was about to become part of something bigger. The first morning at the foundation, Eli arrived early, the navy suit pressed and sharp, a plain white shirt underneath, and a navy and burgundy striped tie that his mom had insisted was professional without being boring. The glass doors reflected the city behind him as he stepped inside, greeted by the quiet hum of activity. The reception area smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The walls were lined with framed photographs of community events, courtroom victories, and youth programs sponsored by the foundation. Marcus was waiting near the elevators, dressed in his usual understated but immaculate style. He gave Eli a quick nod of approval and led him upstairs to an open-plan office where the hum of conversation mingled with the soft clacking of keyboards. People moved with purpose here, their desks piled with case files, research binders, and color-coded schedules. Eli's first week was mostly shadowing a mix of sitting in on meetings, reviewing outreach materials, and listening more than he spoke. He learned that the foundation's work wasn't just about winning court cases. It was about building enough community support and legislative awareness to make change stick. Some days were spent in neighborhoods where sidewalks were cracked and streetlights were dim, meeting local organizers and residents. Other days were spent in state offices under fluorescent lights, presenting research to staffers who would carry it to policymakers. Marcus paired Eli with Jasmine, a program coordinator who specialized in youth engagement. She walked him through the process of organizing events that got young people involved in civic issues, how to choose the right venue, what kind of language encouraged participation, and how to listen for the concerns people weren't always willing to say out loud. Eli followed her to a meeting at a community center one afternoon, where they discussed after-school safety with a group of teenagers. When one boy complained about being hassled by security guards just for sitting on the library steps, Eli recognized the tension in his voice. He remembered exactly how it felt. In quieter moments at the office, Eli found himself reading through reports about policy proposals. One was about expanding access to legal aid in underserved areas. Another focused on reforming shopkeeper laws that were often used to justify discriminatory behavior in stores. The latter caught his attention immediately. He asked Marcus if the foundation ever worked on that kind of legislation. Marcus smiled slightly as if he had been waiting for Eli to ask. "We don't just work on it," he said. "We're leading the push." That week, Eli was invited to sit in on a strategy session. The conference room was lined with whiteboards covered in bullet points and sticky notes. Attorneys and advocates debated language for a draft bill, each word weighed for how it might be interpreted in court or misused in practice. Eli didn't speak during the meeting, but he took notes, trying to follow the threads of the conversation. As the summer went on, he became more comfortable contributing. He helped draft outreach letters, designed flyers for community forums, and even gave a short presentation about youth perspectives in one meeting. He saw firsthand how small actions like changing the wording on a flyer or adjusting the order of speakers could shape how people engaged with an idea. By July, Eli was traveling with the team to events across the city. He'd stand at a folding table with stacks of pamphlets, talking to residents about upcoming town halls or their rights. Under new city ordinances, sometimes people brushed past without making eye contact. But others stopped to talk, sharing stories that mirrored his own in unexpected ways. Each conversation made him more certain that policy wasn't just abstract, it was lived every day. In the way people were treated in stores, on sidewalks, in schools. Marcus checked in with him regularly, often at the end of long days. "Still standing tall?" he'd ask, and Eli would nod even when his feet ached from hours of moving between events. By the end of August, the work had shifted something in him. He'd come in thinking change happened through big, dramatic moments, someone taking a stand in front of a crowd, a judge delivering a verdict. But he'd learned it was also the slow grind of drafting, revising, organizing, and listening. It was shaking hands with someone who didn't trust you yet, and earning their trust one conversation at a time. On his last day, the team gathered in the break room with a cake and a signed card. Marcus handed him an envelope inside. It was a letter of recommendation and a note in Marcus's steady handwriting. "Keep standing tall. The world needs it." Eli slipped the letter back into the envelope, knowing it wasn't the end of his connection to the foundation. The summer had done more than fill his schedule, it had shifted the course of what he imagined possible for his future. The air was cooler now, the autumn wind carrying that faint, sharp edge that hinted winter wasn't far behind. Eli was walking down Main Street, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the pavement. He hadn't been this way in months, not since the summer at the foundation ended, not since his days had been filled with schoolwork, meetings with youth councils, and the quiet planning of what came next. The navy suit hung in his closet at home, pressed and ready, though it had been worn only a handful of times. It wasn't just a suit anymore. It was a reminder of the day everything shifted. The storefront came into view before he realized where his feet were taking him. The tall glass windows were spotless, the mannequins inside dressed in neatly arranged autumn-displaced charcoal coats, deep green ties, polished brown shoes. The gold-lettered name above the door was the same, but something about the place felt different. It took him a moment to spot the small sign near the handle, under new management. He might have kept walking if not for the boy. He couldn't have been more than 15, standing just outside the entrance, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a faded hoodie. His sneakers were scuffed, the laces frayed, and there was a kind of nervous energy in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes darted toward the suits inside, then down at the ground, then back again as though he wasn't sure if he belonged anywhere near them. Eli slowed his steps. Something about the boy's hesitation, slight hunch of his shoulders, the way he lingered at the threshold without crossing it was painfully familiar. Without thinking too much about it, Eli changed direction, walking straight to the door. He reached it just as the boy looked up, startled. "You going in?" Eli asked, his voice even, almost casual. The boy hesitated, glancing again at the rows of suits beyond. "The glass? I'm not sure. I just wanted to look." Eli smiled slightly, recognizing the tone, the uncertainty, and then "let's look." He pulled the door open and stepped aside, holding it in place. The boy stared for a moment, then stepped through, his eyes widening as the warm light from inside washed over him. The store smelled faintly of cedar and pressed fabric. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, their smiles genuine, their greetings warm. No one looked twice at the boy's hoodie or worn shoes. A man in a dark vest approached, asking if they needed help. Eli nodded toward the suit racks. "He's here to find something important," he said, the words rolling off his tongue with an ease that surprised him. The boy's shoulders lifted, a little at that. They walked together through the aisles, running their hands along the smooth fabrics. The boy stopped at a deep navy suit, the shade almost identical to Eli's own. His fingers brushed the sleeve tentatively, as though afraid he might wrinkle it. "You like it?" Eli asked. "Yeah. It's for my cousin's wedding," the boy said, almost apologetically, as if needing a reason to justify even looking. Eli nodded, a quiet memory sparking in the back of his mind. Greg's voice, the sting of being told to prove he belonged here. But the memory didn't twist his stomach anymore. Instead, it only reinforced the simple truth he'd learned. No one should have to earn the right to be treated with dignity. The new manager came over, a woman with kind eyes and a quick smile. She offered to set up a fitting room without hesitation. As she led the boy toward it, Eli caught his reflection in one of the mirrors lining the wall. He looked older, somehow not just in the cut of his clothes or the way he stood, but in the steadiness in his eyes. He didn't stay long after that. Once the boy was settled in the fitting room, Eli turned toward the door. Outside, the street was busy with people heading home from work, the sun dipping lower behind the buildings. He paused for a moment, glancing back through the window. The boy was standing in front of the mirror, the jacket hanging neatly on his shoulders, a smile tugging at his face. Eli let the door swing shut behind him, the faint chime of the bell marking his exit. This time he wasn't leaving with a suit in his hands. He was leaving with the quiet certainty that sometimes coming full circle wasn't about returning to where you started. It was about making sure the next person had an easier way through.